I can predict the future, and you're going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay.
This video contains spoilers for iCarly, the Sex and the City franchise, Spider-Man No Way Home, and regretful mentions of Harry Potter and related works. July 21st, 2007 is a memorable date in the life of many millennials. It's the day the final Harry Potter book came out. Sometime anywhere in the next 12 to 72 hours is an important follow-up date for those same millennials. It's the date we realized, oh, this was written for us, but it was definitely written about them. Them being boomers, Jonesers, and the lucky Gen Xers who didn't find themselves adrift or feeling abandoned by the institutions that raised them. They do exist, I promise. Smarter people than me have addressed how the epilogue, with its high school sweetheart-derived nuclear families, Don Draper-flavored domesticity, easily acquired, well-paying, fulfilling, and stable employment, did not resonate the way its author thought it would. We learned the hard way that it was written from the perspective of someone who had achieved the traditional markers of adulthood. Marriage, children, home ownership, 401ks that you have to figure out how to roll over every time you switch a job. You know, if you're lucky to get a job with a 401k at all. Those of us reading as adults who hadn't or couldn't manage those markers, well, surely that was our own fault, right? The recent video by Sean does an excellent job of laying out how J.K. Rowling's Blairist neoliberal politics explicitly ignores structural and systemic hurdles, instead suggesting that any success or failure is entirely down to an individual's choices and actions. This is, frustratingly, a school of thought that keeps popping up, no matter how often it gets disproven and debunked. 10 years before those 19 years later, the Imagine 2017 written and calcified in or around 1995 bore absolutely zero resemblance to the lives we were already living. It had already aged poorly. Even then, anyone could tell you with an exasperated scoff that, no, all was not going to be well.
Larry, I'm on DuckTales.
Before I get into this section of the video, I'd like to specify that I'm speaking from the perspective of an American born in 1982 who grew up in the Northeast and went to primarily U.S. private schools. That was not the only perspective around me, but I'd like to acknowledge that my perspective can be narrow if I'm not careful, so we're going to be careful. The generally accepted date range for millennials starts around 1980 and extends to around 1996. The oldest millennials keep getting rebranded. First, we were just millennials, because we were coming of age at the turn of the millennium. Very creative. Then we were Zennials, then we were the Oregon Trail generation, then elder millennials, and now they just call us geriatric millennials. How rude! Which, you know what? My back hurts, that's fair. No matter what, this designation capably divides the people who learned Logo on Apple IIe's in elementary school from the kids whose families were likely to have internet in their homes by elementary school. According to this data from the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1997, only 18% of U.S. households had internet capability. That number jumps to 41.5% in just 3 years. And it continues up quickly from there. The youngest U.S. millennials are likely to have internet by middle school, with 68.7% of U.S. homes having internet capability. Perhaps not since the baby boomers have the cultural differences between the youngest and oldest members of a generation been quite this stark. It's easy to forget that when Harry Potter was first published in September of 1998, millennials ranged from toddlers to college freshmen. I first started reading Harry Potter in the year 2000, just after the fourth book came out. I was just in time to join the fandom for what was referred to as the 3-year summer. I would similarly jump on the Sex and the City bandwagon sometime in the summer of 2001. It was definitely early enough that the first post 9/11 episode hit me in my New Yorker heart. Why, yes, those are butterfly clips in my hair. Again, at this point, you have the oldest millennials who are already well into college. At the same time, you have a cohort of 5-year-olds whose first big news story they remember is 9/11. I don't think people who were younger than, say, 15 at the time, really understand what a seismic shift 9/11 was. Everything changed immediately. But let's rewind one more year to see what really set the stage. The 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and then Vice President Al Gore. After the last 8 years, the 2000 election feels quaint, genteel, polite even. Here's the absolute TLDR basics. Like in the 2016 election, the popular vote went to one person, Al Gore, and the electoral vote went to another person, George Bush. Well, sort of. See, what happened was this. There was a bunch of trouble with the ballots out of Florida. They were called butterfly ballots. Butterflies were very big in 2000. The problem was that the butterfly ballot was very confusing, and it was designed in such a way that instead of voting for Al Gore, basically an entire area voted for Pat Buchanan. But here's the thing. He won in counties full of Northern retirees, most of whom were Jewish. You know, Pat Buchanan's usual base. Here's where the story gets really wild. There was a recount. It was in progress. The Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 vote that there didn't need to be a recount, actually. And Gore had been in the lead. And with the 25 votes that the Supreme Court just gave to George W. Bush, they also gave him the election. And just like that, the die of the political landscape for the next 20 years was cast. It brought us such hits as, you know what? I'm not even going to try and do this from memory. We're gonna read it off the list. Go gadget teleprompter. It brought us such hits as the entire mismanagement of intelligence, warning of an imminent terrorist attack. A lot of people deciding that personal liberties were optional, actually. A war against a concept, one of several we already had going. No child left behind. If you see something, say something. The mishandling of Hurricane Katrina. Persistent right-wing takeover of local and increasingly higher offices actually started in 1979 or so, and the subprime mortgage crisis, which led to the 2008 economy crash. It's honestly difficult to say what 2022 would be like in a world without the Bush years. The mealy-mouthed late 90s neoliberal conciliatory politics probably almost certainly would have continued through the Gore years. The slow, ground-up, right-wing takeover started in the late 70s, like I mentioned a minute ago, so that definitely would have continued. Even assuming 9/11 still happened, without puppet masters like Karl Rove and Dick Cheney, I just don't see the same normalization of the erosion of civil liberties. You know, they really saw their chance and they took it. All of that being said, Bush getting the election in 2000 is bad, but any question of legitimacy of rule just went entirely out the window after 9/11. Suddenly, for the whole country, ours was not to question why. Ours was simply to do or die. Or, in a lot of people's cases, just shut up and take it. The pre and post 9/11 divide in art was absolutely fascinating to watch, but it was especially interesting in ongoing works. Of the pop culture things mentioned so far, I really feel like Harry Potter shows that pre and post 9/11 cultural scene the most. Given the 3-year time gap between the fourth and fifth book, given that the fourth book was written probably around 1999 and the fifth book was written over the course of the intervening 3 years, just the worlds in which they were written were just too different. The Fellowship of the Ring trilogy had the lion's share of its filming completed by 2000, so any reactive changes were made in post. Well, which brings us to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Filming on the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie was supposed to have started in November of 2000. Studio snarls and trouble gathering resources held that up until January of 2001. It was supposed to have premiered in November of 2001, but yeah, it's better that didn't happen. It didn't come out until May 2002, but they still had to recut the original theatrical trailer.
Sit back and enjoy the ride.
Because of, that. There's an inherent Gen X quality to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man. There's the fact that Tobey Maguire himself is just solidly Gen X. The man was born in 1975. He's like textbook. After that, I admit it's less specifics and more just vibes, But I keep coming back to this very important element of the second and third films. Peter's shitty apartment. Look, I'm 40 years old. I have literally never lived alone. Finding a place, even a shithole with a communal bathroom that I could afford by myself in New York, in Manhattan, in this economy? Sorry, can't relate. If the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies are the last vestiges of Gen X youth culture weaving with millennial youth culture, the 2010s Amazing Spider-Man movies are just pure millennial culture.
What have you been up to?
I do some web design.
Something that gets touched on a lot about millennials is that we don't have a good understanding of how old we actually are, and other people don't have a good understanding of how old we actually are. We're unmoored. Just a generation of Billy Pilgrims who, even when we don't go anywhere, are just perpetually, always, at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and at the wrong age. Why do I bring this up now? Because, dear friends, as Peter Parker, Andrew Garfield does what millennials do best. Absolutely destroys your concept of time. Think about the first time you saw Andrew Garfield in something. Can you remember? It may be earlier than you realize. In 2007, at the age of 23, he made his debut in a little show from the BBC called Doctor Who, in a completely, unimportant 2-part arc called Daleks in Manhattan. And he then proceeded to not really visibly age over the next 5 years. The Amazing Spider-Man came out in 2012. Peter Parker, implied to be around 17, would have been born around 1995. Playing against born in 1988 Emma Stone, a gramified Sally Field, and eternally middle-aged Dennis Leary, these weren't visually jarring casting choices. It didn't take you out of the scene. The illusion worked. And really round out the full Millennial experience, the third film had its entire support system pulled out from under it and was then unceremoniously canceled. I wonder what that's like. Moving on. The Tom Holland Spider-Man movies really captured childhood in post 9/11 America, especially with the Battle of New York and the blip taking the place of 9/11. Of course, 9/11 is implied to be how we got Iron Man, so maybe they just got all of those traumas? Bully for them! Though I am currently filming this not far from the apartment where I grew up. When I was here in March, I was here for some really serious family stuff. And dealing with that serious family stuff, staying in my teenage bedroom, it was kind of a lot. But the serious family stuff was already in progress in December when I saw Spider-Man No Way Home. And it was all the more poignant because not even 3 minutes into the movie, there was a scene basically shot like right on my doorstep, grappling with things like parental mortality and the idea that the apartment where you grew up is no longer going to be accessible to you. It all combined into a big Voltron of yikes. So in March, we all sort of converged on stately Labradorite Manor, and it was very reminiscent of the third act of Spider-Man No Way Home when Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire show up and 3 generations of Spider-Man are all on the same screen and dealing with their personal traumas together. And, by the time they were all having their big heart-to-hearts, it really was about as subtle as a car bumper to the face. A convergence of generations that technically shouldn't exist in the same space now do, and the differences are clear. But let's talk about that.
Peter! Yeah?
While this should have felt like a cheesy gimmick, and okay, maybe yeah, it was, the movie did some pretty interesting stuff with the concept of having 3 different Peters Parker on screen. Some of this was ground already covered by Into the Spider-Verse. But that movie played with the idea that anyone can be Spider-Man. No Way Home focused on the people who've been Peter Parker. And sorry about that, Jake Johnson. Maybe next time.
You have money, right?
The really beautiful moments of the movie for me were when the Peters Parker took a beat and really grappled with what it meant to be them. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man was repeatedly totally paralyzed by his unresolved trauma. Both Andrew Garfield, the actor, and the Spider-Man he played got acknowledgement that he'd been served a raw deal and was presented with the chance to start healing himself.
Can we rewind it back to the I'm lame part? Because you are not.
No, thanks. No, yeah, I appreciate that. I'm not saying I'm lame. I'm
But
just
it's
saying,
the
like,
self-talk maybe we should, you know.
listen.
Because you're amazing. Just to take it in for a minute.
Yeah, I can take it in. No, I can take it in.
You are amazing.
I can take it in.
You are amazing.
Thank you, yeah,
Will
thanks.
you say it?
No, I kind of needed to hear that.
Are you okay?
Are you okay?
Cheesy? Sure. But also emotionally resonant enough that it worked for me. It's been a rough few years, and finding comfort where we can is important. We're back to the millennial desire for everything to be okay. We're going to need a pink drink for this next segment. iCarly's return and Sex and the City coming back as And Just Like That already had me thinking about this wave of relaunches and trying to place what exactly was the impulse behind them. I was not a regular viewer on the original run of iCarly. I was 25 when it premiered, hardly its target demographic. I mean, I certainly watched enough Degrassi The Next Generation that it wouldn't have been entirely out of the realm of possibility. Last year, thanks to the works of CJ the X and Quentin Reviews, I got sort of a crash course in the show's content and history that when the relaunch got announced for Paramount Plus, I mean, I have Paramount Plus. I figured, what the heck, I'll watch it. Even before those videos, I already knew sort of who the characters were and like what the premise was, and of course, the memes. As someone so far from the target audience, I had absolutely no idea what to expect from the relaunch. I did, however, really enjoy it, enough that I watched the second season as well. Even for someone with only a surface level understanding of the show, it felt like an honest and reasonably organic extrapolation of where those characters would be 10 years later. I adore the addition of Chelsea. As a new viewer, I had less of the, but she's not Sam, to work through. It certainly didn't hurt that I was already a Lacey Mosley fan from her work on a Black Lady sketch show. Her energy just fits perfectly. I especially enjoy watching her play off Jerry Trainer. Like, just their energy just works so well together. I love it. Sometimes the jokes that are intended to adult up the material fail a little bit, but overall, I'm glad I picked up the show. I enjoy it. And honestly, from an absolute narrative standpoint, I am weak to stories set in the same fictional universe. Look, I mean that too, but specifically new stories set in a familiar universe. This is in no small part how and why Tamora Pierce still has a loyal reader in me 30 years later. I think that hurt both of us. But as someone who was already an adult when iCarly began, the passage of time reflected by television-grade precocious teens and tweens becoming characters believably in their late 20s, it felt too subtle. For it to really stand out to me, it would need to be more dramatic, more real time, more personal. So the interesting thing about the flattening of time is that I was 16 when Sex and the City started, Carrie Bradshaw was 32, and life as an adult was largely foreign to me. Now I'm 40, she is 55, and I am also struggling with writing and podcasts and bad joints and my peers and loved ones dying. Many of us have already grappled with the idea that we are older than Homer Simpson. I'm older than Carrie Bradshaw was during the entire run of Sex and the City is just a whole different level of time dilation.
25! Fuck, I'm old!
Quick aside. In a similar vein to these takes on the future, I was a big fan of the CW's The Carrie Diaries. And I, in some ways, felt it told a better story than Sex and the City. An interesting juxtaposition is that in The Carrie Diaries, Carrie was 16 and I was 31. Talk about a fun inversion of today's theme. And just like that, received a lot of criticism for the ways bringing Carrie and her friends into 2021 felt corny or ham-fisted or cringe, or corny, ham-fisted, and cringe. I enjoyed it a lot more than many of the critics, but basically anything to do with Charlotte or Miranda suddenly having black friends and Miranda discovering her sexuality in like the least honorable way possible meant I was watching through my hands just like everybody else. Just woof. I started a group chat that I literally titled, and just like that, I threw my phone at the television because yikes. Watching Charlotte emotionally struggle over having a non-binary child was rough. Watching her use the term they mitzvah, unchecked might I add, when the gender-neutral term benign mitzvah was just like right there, it was worse. That was just worse. But also, these women aren't millennials. Even though they're not, watching them struggle with things like gender and sexuality and race, like they were new concepts, it was not great. It made it feel like they had been cryogenically frozen instead of just like living the last two presidential administrations off screen. To say nothing of the fact that however clumsily handled they were and poorly aged, the original run already showed us Samantha in a relationship with a woman, Charlotte being friends with lesbians, Miranda and Samantha both dating black men, and look, the less said about Samantha's interactions with trans women, just the better. But it did happen. Like, it happened. I know that I personally have been engaging and re-engaging with these topics, since Sex and the City went off the air in 2004. I also know that my 2004 opinions are not the same as my 2008 opinions or my 2010 opinions or now. It felt disingenuous and honestly unkind to the characters that the show acted like these women hadn't been doing these things even a little bit. Especially Miranda, who we are explicitly told in the first episode, has been doing like pro bono work and it's implied that she has been doing the work, as it were, to then see her go into her, fucking I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could have moments. Like, just, oof. It didn't sit right with me. And of the three of them, Carrie seemed to fare better in a lot of these ways. While she is unmistakably Generation X, Carrie's experiences have always felt familiar to those of us who became adults while watching the show. Geezer Zennials like me. Because while she did get married, she never had kids. While she did own her own home, or homes, technically, because we find out that she has kept her old apartment this entire time and just used it as a closet and Blatch B&B. The Fifth Avenue apartment was paid for by Big. And her once and future apartment was paid for using the money she guilt-tripped out of Charlotte after Charlotte sold her engagement ring from Trey. Do not get me started on that episode. I haven't been angrier with a fictional character than I was with Carrie ever. Ah! It's cool. It's okay. I'm fine. My personal feelings aside, that episode, which aired in 2002, was surprisingly prescient of the financial travails of the two generations who have spent the last 15 years robbing Peter to PayPal. I mean, PayPal. And honestly, what's more millennial than returning to an old familiar space when the life you thought you were going to have has fallen apart? In the 6 months or so since I sat down to write this script, it seemed like every week there was another episode or a movie or something that seemed to wrestle with a lot of these concepts. And wait, this feels wrong. Yes, this is correct. And I couldn't help but wonder, what has us all asking these questions? There has been a stunning number of works that feel like they're playing in this space. Movies like Encanto, Turning Red, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and the second season of Russian Doll all grab our families by the collar and yell, "We are going to deal with the generational trauma in our family if I have to tear the entire fabric of the universe apart to do it." While that isn't exactly the stated thesis of this video, it's still an entire generation's creatives, living out the fantasy that we're not just going to be okay, but we're going to heal. We're going to thrive. And then there was Chippendales Rescue Rangers. Look, this was a movie they could have phoned in from space. It could have been 90 minutes of joyless, weekly plotted parades of, hey, remember that thing? Hey, remember that thing? Hey, how about this thing? You remember that thing? It could have been that, but it wasn't. But instead, it's actually a really thoughtful examination of nostalgia and what happens when life doesn't go as planned. While iCarly and Just Like That and Spider-Man No Way Home mainly focus on the right now, with only the occasional expository review. Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers really interrogates the, like, no, really, what happened? To a degree that feels weirdly aggressive, given that it's Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers. This is not a critique, by the way. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that we got the movie that we got. It was just, not the source that I expected to show that degree of self-awareness and introspection. I kept expecting, like, a really coked up BoJack Horseman to show up and, like, try and tempt Dale into a bender. Possibly with Bender. Honestly, BoJack Horseman is a good reference here. It was one of the first shows that really examined how the late 90s really wrote a lot of checks that the 2010s absolutely could not cash. No. The BoJack Horseman closing theme fits here. Just as none of us in 2014 were really prepared for the Sad Horse Show to become, well, the Sad Horse Show, most of us weren't expecting Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers to come for its own masters, literal, as in Disney, and figurative, the perpetual merchandising and marketing machine that feeds on and is fed by nostalgia. Look, we are nothing if not creatures evolved to take what we need from the media that was given to us, no matter how soulless or insipid, and then reinvent it in ways that are both insightful and incisive. I've been struggling how to conclude all of this. I started writing this in December. I finished writing it in June, but since I began writing, just like a parade of bad stuff, both personal and global, has happened. My dad died. He died in February. The political landscape in Texas which is where I live, went from not great, Bob, to everything I was afraid of from 2014 and a whole lot more. The political landscape on a national level has gone from not great, Bob, to everything I was afraid of from 2016 on and a whole lot more. So that's fun. I cannot stress how hard it is to want to learn and grow and improve oneself or plan or set goals when I don't feel comfortable making so much as lunch plans next week. Maggie Mae Fish's brilliant video Crashing, which I sent immediately to my therapist upon finishing it, has addressed many of these emotions head on. The reaction she received has only highlighted just how fucking exhausted so many of us are. As cohorts, millennials and Gen Z were raised to be a largely optimistic bunch. We were told we were going to change the world. And I really wanted to believe it. I grew up with a first generation parent who, built his life, and I really thought I was going to, continue building on that. But it's hard to maintain optimism. And after the last 20 years have been just an exhausting slog of malfeasance and mismanagement and a culture that seems to be gleefully, willingly wandering, a well-lit, well-marked primrose path into fascism and extremism. All that said, we also believe in what we can see. And whether that's worlds where COVID is really over, and just like that, never happened, like in iCarly, or where we can get a hug and a pep talk from our alternate selves, both Spider-Man and Everything Everywhere All at Once, we really just can't repress the millennial urge to believe that
you're going to be okay.
Thank you very much for watching this. This is, at this point, the most personal and emotional video that I've posted, I really believe that there is a cultural zeitgeist level reason that we are checking in on fictional people that we loved to make sure that they're okay now. Because we want to know that, Carrie and Charlotte and Miranda are still meeting for brunch. We want to know that Carrie is going to reconnect with Samantha in Paris. We want to know that Chip and Dale are still together and still bros. We want to know that, iCarly is still doing her thing and still successful at it. We want to know that Tobey Maguire, Peter Parker, has thrived into middle age as Spider-Man. We want to know this. If we want to know that if our fictional friends are okay, that we can be okay too. If you liked this, please give it a like. Please subscribe. Please share it. Please send it to your friends. I like to think that I've tapped into something here, and I'm curious to know if other people have as well. So please, I do have a Patreon. I do have Ko-Fi. I have Twitter. I have everything. It's on in the description. Thank you. To being okay. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. I feel fine.